and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, Talk Loud, Say Nothing, 27th of August 2014. Where did freedom of speech go? We cannot say anything anymore and must comply with political correctness. So how is anyone going to debate anything other than fluffy nonsense in all types of media? Don't mention a group that you think is likely to be responsible for acts of terrorism. Don't say that any one group of people is committing the majority of crime. Don't say that one group of people is responsible for anything unless they're Caucasian and or perhaps Christian. But don't you dare mention anyone else. Talk about the weather or what half-witted program is on television and you are with the in crowd. God help us. Maureen Story, Rockingham. Okay, so this is one of those typical freedom of speech letters. And there's several points that they're missing here. And to be honest, I think many people who write these kind of letters or express these sentiments are genuine in what they're saying, is they honestly feel like their freedom of speech is being curtailed because they feel like they can't say the things that they used to say, for example. They just happen to be wrong on that. So first of all, if you want to say that you think that terrorists tend to be Muslims or that Aboriginal people tend to commit more crime, there is nothing stopping you from saying that. You have the freedom of speech that you've always had to say that. The government is not going to come and lock you up. No one is going to accuse you of committing some crime for saying these things unless you go much too far and cross over into racial vilification. You can essentially say everything that you've always been able to say. What you can't do is expect that to be free of consequences. And that's what's changed, is that many people won't accept that anymore and will use their freedom of speech to disagree with you. Now, that's not curtailing your freedom of speech. Freedom of speech doesn't mean that you get to say whatever you want without criticism. What it means is that nobody comes and locks you up for having said something that's unpopular. And that's precisely, you've got the same rights. The thing is that most of us disagree with you these days, whereas perhaps not that long ago, many people would have agreed with you. The fact that you now find yourself in a minority opinion means that you'll be criticised for what you say, and there may be other social consequences, but that is not an impingement of your freedom of speech. So you can still say it. And if you want to debate these things, you certainly can. You may not find a place to debate these issues in mainstream media because, generally speaking, mainstream media has accepted that racism is, racist claims are false and are not to be aired. But that's the other thing about freedom of speech, is freedom of speech doesn't mean that you get an audience or a platform. So you don't have the right to be taken seriously and published in a newspaper, for example, just because you get to say that thing. Freedom of speech means you can go out in the street and say it and the police won't come and get you. That's it. So the fact that you won't find an airing for racist views in mainstream media isn't actually an impingement on your freedom of speech. You can still air those views in exactly the same forums that you have the right to air them, that is, in public. One of the main reasons why political correctness, as it were, or society in general, does no longer accept this idea that we can identify, say, terrorism with particular religions or crime with particular ethnic groups is because those comparisons at best are only true in a strict technical sense and are generally false in the more broad sense that what they tend to imply. So to suggest that Aboriginal people commit crime at a higher rate than white people is strictly true, but that historically has been used to argue that there is something implicit in Aboriginalness or in Aboriginal culture that encourages criminal behaviour, and we know that to be false. And so when you make this claim, it is true in a technical sense, but it also echoes and implies for a great many people something that is very false and pernicious and damaging for Aboriginal people. Also, it's not a useful way of understanding why people commit crime and helping them deal with it. It's much more accurate to say that poor people commit crime. We know that our poverty actually disproportionately influences people's crime rates, and that it happens that Aboriginal people are disproportionately poor. So actually a better explanation is to say that poor people commit crime, rather than to say that Aboriginal people commit crime. Aboriginality doesn't really predict much at all. Similarly with terrorism, the vast majority of Muslims don't commit terrorist acts. So to say that terrorism is associated with Islam is strictly true, but not particularly helpful in identifying or dealing with the issue of terrorism. You actually have to look for what is the actual causative factors, and simply being a Muslim is not enough. Overwhelmingly, if you deal with terrorism as a Muslim issue, you end up dealing with the majority of Muslims who have no terrorist inklings, and therefore you end up wasting your time. And that's the reason why most of us have moved away from those sentiments. Is one, because they're rooted in a kind of, or at least they encourage kind of racism that most of us don't agree with, and that is broadly speaking just simply false. But secondly, it's not a useful way of looking at these issues. So yeah, there you have it. That's why most people don't agree with you, but we don't impinge on your free speech. You can say as much bigoted stuff as you like, as long as you fall short of vilifying an entire race of people, and we won't stop you. We'll just vigorously disagree with you. Paying for a GP, 29th of August 2014. Every time I go to the doctor, I pay about $75, and then get $28 back from Medicare. This has been happening for many years and at different doctors. The only people I know who get free medical treatment are pensioners and those who get the locum out after hours. So who are the people who get free doctor visits? Is it an Eastern States thing? Linda Smith Como. So the way the system works here is general practitioners, or GPs, can actually set their rates. The government has a fixed amount that the GP is reimbursed for, and if the GP is not happy with that fee structure, they can charge the patient the difference. And the usual way it goes is that you pay the full amount up front to your GP, and then you get reimbursed a certain amount through Medicare. Now, there is a system whereby there is no upfront cost to the patient, and this is referred to as bulk billing. So people who are bulk billed essentially get free treatment, but the GPs aren't obliged to bulk bill people. Some GPs do, and some GPs don't, and so many GPs do for some categories of people and not for others. And my experience has basically been the same as the letter writer here. I always pay up front about $70 to see the doctor. I get about $30 of that back from the government, leaving me about $40 out of pocket. Because I live in a fairly well-to-do area and I'm, not poor, relatively affluent, certainly in the middle of society, I feel like that's fair. Now, I actually looked up the data on this. So I assumed that most people in this area that I live in, I actually happen to live in the same general area as the letter writer here, yet weren't bulk billed. Certainly all the practices I know of in this area don't bulk bill. I always assumed it was poor people who were bulk billed and that you'd find them in other suburbs, and I always assumed that that was the way it went. When I looked up the data, actually, the area here that we live in, it's something like 75% of doctors' visits are bulk billed. And that's because, I think, the bulk of doctors' visits are made up of pensioners who go frequently rather than young people like me who go rarely. And so there's a relatively small cohort of people who are particularly sick, pensioners, old sick pensioners, who go to the GP regularly. And because they are pensioners, they are bulk billed for that. That's usually the way that these doctor surgeries manage to stay afloat, is that they will bulk bill the needy and they will not bulk bill people like me who pay up front, and I essentially subsidise the healthcare costs of the less fortunate, the older, the more infirm, and the worse off. People who are, it's called a healthcare card essentially. If you earn under a certain amount, if you're basically poor, you get a healthcare card which entitles you to drastically reduced prices on your medications, and generally speaking, doctors will bulk bill. So it turns out Western Australia, despite our booming industry, etc., we're still looking at about 75% of GP visits are bulk billed, which means that actually a lot of doctors' visits do have no out-of-pocket cost. Despite, I guess, my sense to the contrary. And what's been talking about recently is putting a fee for all visits, so that those people who would ordinarily get it for free would be charged something like $7. And so that's what this letter writer is talking about. And that's why, because such a high proportion of visits are actually free, that's why even a small amount, a $7 fee, actually would be a bad thing, because the sickest are the poorest and sickest people have to go regularly, and so they would be hardest hit by it. People like me who are young and affluent would barely feel the extra $7. Too quick on the draw. 2nd of September 2014. Brian Gale, Machine Guns for Girls, Letters, 30th of the 8th, commented on the parents of a 9-year-old US girl who accidentally had fatally shot her instructor with a Uzi submachine gun. Who does Brian think he is to question what another parent teaches their own child? Just because he doesn't want his children to learn this does not give him the right to judge others. Fair enough to give your opinion, but leave it at that. My kids will not be sheltered from the real world. How else will they see all sides of an issue if they have only ever looked from one side? Chris Green, Jindalee. Defensive much? This letter is in response to another letter in which the person wrote literally one line that said, "What sort of father wants his young daughter to know how to fire a Uzi submachine gun?" That's all it asked. And I think it's a valid question. When you see a 9-year-old girl shooting a submachine gun, it is a valid question to ask, why is the parent encouraging this? What value does this serve? This isn't responsible gun ownership and training, to use a firearm for hunting, for some kind of, responsible use, even for self-defense. I mean, an Uzi submachine gun, this is having fun with a gun, which is part of the US fetishization of gun culture. And plays into all of that. And to do that with a 9-year-old child, I do think that raises reasonable questions about what was the parent trying to accomplish here. And the idea that, okay, you don't have the right to judge, is just wrong. I have the right to judge everybody. I don't have the right to judge them in a legal sense. But that idea that you're entitled to your opinions, you are entitled to make judgments about other people. You're not. It's not a great thing to go and enforce that on other people, but it's certainly a reasonable thing that we have the right to do. And to simply make a one-line question is hardly being all that judgmental, especially given the circumstances. And the idea that you'd be, by not allowing my 9-year-old child to learn to fire a submachine gun, that I'm somehow sheltering them or not exposing them to the real world, is an appallingly stupid idea. It is hardly, especially in the context of Australian context, but even in the US context, it's hardly the real world where 9-year-old children need to learn to shoot submachine guns. Even in the worst crime-affected, where even if you could mount an argument that firearm training is an essential and useful part of American culture, teaching a 9-year-old to fire a machine gun is hardly a useful thing to do. And I wouldn't even buy that argument, and certainly not in the Australian context. This is just an absurdly stupid thing that has happened here. It is stupid to expose 9-year-old children to firearms in that way. And it interests me that the letter writer here is so defensive about it. Is courtesy the answer? 2nd of September 2014. A drive through the suburbs establishes that there is a dismally low standard of driving, Death Traps 30th of the 8th. Perhaps if the standard of driving was raised and driving skills, including consideration for other road users, was improved before a licence was issued, we might see a reduction in the grief and tragedy now being experienced. Dave Jackson, Quinns Rocks. I assume, based on your call for better driver training and more stricter licensing, that you actually don't understand what the current driver licensing system is here. We have the most strict driver's licensing conditions for new drivers out of all of Australia, and I suspect that they're actually comparable, if not exceeding, much of the rest of the Western world. So here we have a system whereby, in order to become a driver, you must pass through 4 phases. There are 2 learners phases and 2 provisional driver's license phases, and there are tests at each phase. There is education that needs to be undertaken at each of the learners phases. You must have drive under instruction and under supervision for a minimum number of hours under a certain number of conditions, so nighttime driving as well as daytime driving. You have to pass not just a practical test, but a theory test. Actually, I think there's multiple theory tests. We have a very strict way of licensing, and compared to when I learned to drive, which was only, well, I guess it was 16 years ago now, 17 years ago. Compared to then, the actual instruction and requirement for new drivers now is fantastic. And so if you are right in arguing that it's the skill and the courtesy of drivers that's the issue, then the issue is not with new drivers, and the solution will not be found in changing or particularly found in changing the current system of licensing. The issue probably is with older drivers. That is, those of us who've been driving for a while and don't drive in the way that we were taught to drive. We drive in the way that we've developed our own style. And I suspect that there is a culture of driving here. That is, that people, after they've got their license, are shaped by the way that other people around them drive, and that they tend towards the prevailing culture. And that's probably much more the issue. I would suggest some kind of mass marketing campaign that targets drivers who have been had their license for quite a while would probably be the way to go, if indeed courtesy and driving skills were the issue. I certainly don't think it's the young, new drivers that are primarily causing this. Lastly for this week, Time to Stand Up, 2nd of September 2014. Jeff Dunstone, A Lesson to Learn, Letters, 29th to the 8th, warns against Australian military involvement in Iraq. He might do well to heed an old quote: "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." Sometimes we cannot wait for evil to arrive on our doorstep. Standing up to IS is one of those times. Chris Rigby, Mandurah. I actually don't like that quote because it suggests that literally, whenever there is some evil force in the world, if we don't stand up to it, that evil force will eventually take over and triumph. And that is just not true. It doesn't require every single good person to stand up against every evil force in order for that evil force not to take over the entire world. It could. I see no inevitable consequence of Australian non-involvement in the Middle East somehow causing the Islamic State to end up ruling the world or landing on our doorstep. There are many other situations that may take place. There are many other actors who may step in and do things. And so to argue that we are required to step in whenever anything goes wrong in the world, I think is just blatantly false. Now, the other thing is that Australian military involvement is generally a token gesture. We do not have a large military, and we are not willing to commit a large military to operations outside of our own local area. So we had a relatively large presence in East Timor-Leste. We also have a presence, not just military, but in other areas in the South Pacific, where we do all sorts of good work. But we are reluctant to deploy large numbers of people elsewhere. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had very small number of troops. And at the height of our involvement in Afghanistan, I believe that we didn't even reach 1,000 people. That's not to say that they don't do good work. They do. But the value of Australian involvement to, say, the US, who generally spearheads these things, is a political value. That is, that we are just showing our support, and so the US can say that they are acting with the support of other nations. Not that we have any real practical value. If we weren't there, militarily, the US would be just as powerful. So this idea that we would be making a meaningful military contribution to the fight against the Islamic State is just false. And so we should see this as a political issue, really, for Australia. Is us lending our support politically the right thing to do? Given other interventions that have gone terribly wrong recently and have not led to particularly prosperous and great societies in their wake, I would like to see a better plan first. There is suggestion of us arming one side against the other, and I'm not really convinced that that is going to have the long-term benefits we think it might, especially given the poor track record that we've had of arming Afghanistan, fighters in Afghanistan in the early 80s, and arming some of Iraq in their fight against Iran. So, yes, I think we should be cautious of our military involvement anywhere, not because we are a massive military power, but because it lends political credence to, and it gives us moral responsibility for the outcomes in those areas. And recently we've had a number of bad outcomes that we've been responsible for. Anyway, that's it for me for this week. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next time when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.